They work at the intersection of emerging technology, policy, and society. They are here to talk about deceptive design. Leader and design researcher at Pranava Institute, Titiksha and Dhanyashri.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Titiksha, and I think we've talked a lot talked and heard a lot in the morning about models we think through, about inspirations, about optimism with regards to technology. And I think this is the perfect time to jump into what we're going to talk about today. So this button, which seems very innocuous, very simple. If some of us are designers, many of us are in this room, we've designed something like this, where you have two options on a screen. One says, go private, for instance, and then another one says skip. And you can very clearly see that the skip button is pre-selected in this case. This very simple design choice that TikTok made cost it 345 million euros in the European Union a couple of years ago. It's not a small amount for any company, even if they are one of the largest tech giants in the world. If you are a designer, if you are somebody who works in the tech space, if you are somebody who is a technologist, if you are a product manager, or have anything to do with building digital interfaces and digital experiences, well, then deceptive design is something you should know about. So just to very quickly introduce myself, I am Titiksha Vashisht. I am co-founder and lead researcher at the Pranava Institute. This project is something that me and my collaborator, Dhanyashri, who you just saw on the screen, worked very closely on over the last 2 years. Building for the world, deceptive design matters, right? So in the next 13 minutes, I will very quickly take you through what is deceptive design and how can you tackle them to make digital spaces more safe and more trustworthy for your users. I'm Titiksha from the Pranava Institute, and the core thing that we essentially do at Pranava is we ask how are emerging technologies changing our society, and through understanding how technology shapes our society, can we offer better policy recommendations and better policy approaches, so to speak, right, to build a better future. And so in the last 2 years, we've worked very deeply on the question of deceptive design. This is something that used to be called dark patterns, a term which was coined by Harry Brignall around 2009, 2010, very early on, when no regulator, no consumer protection authorities, no competition regulators were looking at this problem. And almost a decade later today, a whole lot of regulators across the world are looking at deceptive design. But we started thinking about this project called the Design Beyond Deception project in 2 ways. First, we wanted to understand how does deceptive design impact Indian users. A lot of the research that we found was essentially done with users in the European Union or in what is broadly called the global north. There was very little evidence to suggest or even talk about the sort of harms that people in India face. And we know that deception is a very cultural thing, right? So we really wanted to unpack that piece of the puzzle. The second thing we wanted to look at was, well, academics in, for example, human-centered design, privacy, they're all looking at deception very closely, and they perhaps know all there is to know about it. But what about designers? What about practitioners? What if we went to a design school and asked students, hey, have you guys heard about this before? Do you think about responsibility and ethical practice when you think about UI, UX design, new media design, you name it? And we realized that's where the gap essentially lay. While there was a whole lot of work within academic communities looking at deception, there was very little done to translate this complex jargon into something that designers could pick up and use. So our inquiry was essentially twofold, like I mentioned. And what we tried to do there is essentially map 3 things. We wanted to understand what are deceptive design patterns, what are the sort of cognitive biases which they use to essentially trick users to do things that users may not otherwise do. So what we are very clear about here is deception is not nudging. Deception is not persuasion. I know these are very standard questions that come to me when I talk about it. But deception is essentially something which uses human cognitive biases, right? Human vulnerabilities to essentially create harm. And so we were very clear about the fact that these interactions have the possibility of creating harms for somebody. Think about a scenario where you go to a store to buy a new dress, or you take your young daughter or son to buy them a new dress for their birthday. And when you go into the store, you're browsing, you're looking at different dresses, some colors are interesting, and you pick perhaps 2 or 3 options. And then you get into the trial room to see, does it really look good on you? And lo and behold, you cannot get out of the trial room until and unless you buy a dress. If this ever happened to you in real life, you would essentially lodge a police complaint against that particular business or that particular store. But this is precisely the kind of thing which is happening to us as users and consumers of online services, as more and more of what we do becomes online, right from shopping to education to social media and information. We rely so much on the digital space to learn about the world and keep updated with it. Deception is becoming a very common problem, which I'm sure almost all of you have faced at some point in your life. And these are some examples of what these deceptive patterns look like, right? So there is pre-selection, there is privacy zuckering, there is forced registration where you have no options. And it's essentially about limiting the choices that you give your users in their online interaction. And deception comes in many shapes and forms. There are many types which have been looked at, right? So there is visual interference, there is roach motel, where if you get into something, it's very hard for you to get out. There is subscription traps. So you could subscribe in 2 buttons, but essentially to unsubscribe from a service, it takes about 7 to 8 steps. Or it takes an offline media for you to call somebody and say, I no longer want this service. There is confirm shaming. There is fake social proof, which even if we don't know, all of us have fallen for at some point. There is forced action, pre-selection. And this is precisely why deceptive design also becomes difficult to tackle, because it's a whack-a-mole problem. The minute you start saying, OK, as a business, let's say you're a designer, and you say, we're not going to design something which is akin to a roach motel, what essentially happens? You have the creativity and the skills to design something which may not be a roach motel, but in fact has the same impact on your user. A quick clarification here, because this is a point of confusion for many of us, is deceptive design are not accessibility guidelines. This is not about making interfaces more accessible. Neither is it about privacy compliance, although privacy, in order to be an actionable right for anyone, requires a non-deceptive interface. Deceptive design is essentially about designing systems and creating data architectures which are trustworthy and safe for our users, right? So we looked at a whole lot of deceptive patterns. There are over 100 which are classified today. And we were like, well, we can never regulate this well. You can never say, oh, don't use this particular pattern. And that's where some interesting and useful thinking sort of came into play, right? So what we ended up doing is we mapped these deceptive design patterns to consumer harms in 2 ways. One, we started thinking about what sort of harms create personal consumer detriment. So what causes you as a person harm because of a deceptive design practice? And then we realized, well, it just does not stop with one single person now, does it? If all of us have a harm which is, let's say, a privacy harm through forced disclosure, right? We have to disclose our personal information, or, well, we have no other option to use a particular service. Done enough number of times and over a large amount of people and at scale, it leads to extreme structural consumer detriment. And this is something where we've seen a lot of increased regulatory attention, because more and more regulators across the world are realizing that deceptive design does not just lead to financial loss or privacy harms or psychological detriment for users, but it in fact makes our digital economy weaker. And over the long run, it reduces the trust in digital interfaces for all users, right? And we have increasingly mounting evidence for this. It also weakens and distorts competition, which is very, very essential for us to have maximum amount of choice in our online interactions. So what can we as designers or product leaders and technology shapers do? Well, a lot of our work, and as a part of our project, we produced something called the Design Beyond Deception manual. And now this manual is made for practitioners like yourself. And our idea was to essentially create actionable frameworks from a lot of this academic literature in ways which you can essentially engage with. And so one of those, for example, is something called the TAO framework. It's transparency, agency, ownership. So at the top, trust is essentially at the center of creating non-deceptive interfaces. And at the top, we have transparency, we have choice, and data ownership as perhaps three very important pillars of creating this digital trust. In transparency, we look at consistency, reliability, price. A lot of this framework building is a result of us thinking and constantly engaging with many stakeholders, including designers, VCs, policymakers, and lawyers, to understand what are possible alternatives for tomorrow. We can think more deeply about how our products impact language and accessibility. So for instance, our research showed that people often had services available to them in their local language, while a lot of the terms and conditions and legalese was in Elizabethan English, which even you as a graduate who studied in English their whole life will not be able to decipher. Language and accessibility create increased vulnerability for users. Similarly, we realized that deceptive design disproportionately impacted first-time digital users who were just coming online in the global south and southern Asia. And third is deceptive design was not just about screens. It's not just about our UI, UX interfaces, right? It's actually it's essentially a way of building technology which has seeped into various kinds of digital interfaces and interactions we have. So for instance, a part of our research was understanding how assistive technologies, which are used, for example, by users with visual disability, also have deceptive patterns within them. Think about it. You are a disabled person who's using these tools to make the world accessible to you, right? It's essentially an assistive tool, and that tool itself is riddled with dark patterns which you may not be aware of. The big question, essentially, and speakers before me have tackled this and talked about it. I guess we'll talk about it over the next 2 days while we're at this conference, is what happens with AI, right? Today, you can essentially create a new website in 6 seconds, right? By saying, oh, this is what I want, this is the core audience that I'm looking at. You input essentially just 3 answers, and you have a ready-to-make, ready-to-deploy website in place. Well, as with most things, and I think the speaker before me talked a lot about the process and not just the outcome when it comes to models, I think this precisely adds to that point by saying deception in equals deception out. If these models are essentially trained on extremely deceptive design patterns, what they're going to give out, whether you use AI or not, will be deceptive interfaces. The big question, I think, that I would want to close with is, how do we ensure that emerging technologies remain deception-free and proactively design beyond deception? And we wanted to essentially do this exercise by looking at these 4 very important value statements. I think we need to start by acknowledging the fact that technology is not neutral. I'm not the first person to say this. Langdon Winner was perhaps the first person to say it in his book. But technology, we assume, is neutral, and the world is, and people can come up with millions of examples of this neutrality. But as we enter the world of AI and we're engaging in these public debates of what AI can and cannot do, we realize that technology is essentially embedded with values of its makers. It's embedded with the values of the society and the ecosystem in which it is playing out. And so for all of us, whatever part we may be playing in the development of this digital world, our values flow into our products. They flow, whether we are deliberate about it or not, into what we do. And finally, these values, once they are flowed into our product, impact society. Just think about it. If any one of you essentially works in tech, perhaps your values impact society at a scale which is unprecedented. Because the minute you ship that product, millions of people are going to be impacted by it. That's not small, and I think that calls for greater responsibility on all our parts. To this rather thorny problem, I guess we are the answer, right? as design teams, as leaders, as researchers, as product managers, as collectives, as strategists looking at product, as organizations, we need to come together and think about building a future which is more safe and trustworthy. And this is precisely what we tried to do yesterday. So we held a 3-hour-long workshop called Designing Beyond Deception. It's a trusted patterns workshop at DesignUp, which we did last afternoon. And we got some very interesting responses from folks who are amidst you in the audience, giving us alternatives to what were design choices which people were essentially finding. Last, and I'll just take a few more seconds before I close, is if you are someone building for the world, not just it's not about India, it's not about your small community or your target audience, but we are all building for the world in ways we don't realize, right? A huge part of doing that exercise, when we think about staying ahead of the curve in so many ways, AI is essentially like that, right? We want to stay ahead of the curve and find out what's the best way to kind of integrate this into our process. Staying ahead of the curve also comes vis-a-vis policy, which is what I essentially do in my day-to-day life, right? We are increasingly seeing regulatory action across the world on deceptive design practices. This is true, of course, it started with the GDPR, but also with the Digital Services Act, with UK's age-appropriate design code. Essentially, this map is a whole lot filled out than when I created it, right up to, of course, India, where our data protection bill addresses concerns of deceptive design, but also our guidelines for prevention and regulation of dark patterns, which was released last year. So before you know it, you will essentially have to comply and give in to the legal requirements of designing more responsibility. Why not do it proactively? Stay ahead of the curve with increased regulatory action globally, which is anyway coming for us. I think the last note I want to leave on is design is power in many, many ways. And I think this is something we all need to reflect on as we are sitting together at a design conference. We often talk about, yeah, but I have such a limited role in my company. How can I make this big change, right? I think we all have a role to play, especially as designers who yield so much influence in how the world is shaped. I think we need to think of design from a more empowered place and think about how we can build safer, better, and trustworthy digital spaces. Thank you so much.